You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 9.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook of your choice and a 30-day free trial by visiting borntokickarse.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. To download your free audiobook today, go to borntokickarse.com/audible. Again, that's borntokickarse.com/audible for your free audiobook. Do you know someone or know of someone who walks the walk and would like to hear them on the Born to Kick Arse podcast? They can be from any field, but they need to have an inspiring story that will help to motivate others to achieve their own goals. If you do, please head over to borntokickarse.com/suggest a guest and fill out the form. We'd love to hear from you. Having already conquered a solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, John Beeden knew in his heart that he still had more, much more. In December 2015, John became the first person to successfully row non-stop across the enormous Pacific Ocean, from San Francisco to Cairns in Australia. Averaging up to 15 hours per day for 209 days, John rowed approximately 14,000 kilometres. Constantly battling ocean winds and currents, John would regularly be blown hundreds of kilometres backwards. What makes John's story truly remarkable is that he has also survived open heart surgery. Enjoy the interview. John Beeden, thanks for your time today and welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for having me, and I'm sure it'll be a pleasure.
Now, you've just completed, I think, was it December? End of December, you've completed an absolutely incredible adventure. You're the first person to have rowed non-stop from land to land, from San Francisco in North America to Cairns, across the largest ocean on Earth, the Pacific Ocean. How long did that take?
Absolutely. It took me 209 days. And as you say, I'm the first person to make continent to continent. There was a guy called Peter Bird in 1983 who came very close. After 294 days at sea, he ended up being rescued by the Australian Navy before he got blown around the Gulf of Carpentaria. But since then, nobody else has got across the equator in one bound. So few people have done it in 3 stages over 2 or 3 years, but I'm the first person to solo non-stop.
That's incredible. So that's about 14,000 kilometres of rowing.
Yeah, give or take a third of the world's circumference.
Yeah, that's
what's in perspective.
Before we sort of dive into that, can you maybe give us a background into yourself? The early days. What were you into? What sort of sports were you into? And I guess what led you to rowing?
Absolutely. So I'm in my 50s now, and in my late teens, I started running back in the early 80s, just about when the marathon boom was kicking off. London Marathon started in 1981, I think. I started running about 1980. Knew nothing about running, and there wasn't a lot of information about it at the time, and kind of stumbled about a little bit. Did 2 marathons in not very impressive times, but really enjoyed it. Eventually found a good running group with a great coach, and started racing on the track and on the roads, and stopped marathon running. Started 5,000 metre steeplechase were my track events, cross country, shorter road races, 10Ks, up to kind of half marathon really. So I did that right through my 20s, 30s, into my late 30s, and I had a business that kind of started to take over. My kids came along in my mid 30s, so it became difficult to compete. But I kept running, and I consider myself a recreational runner these days, even though I still probably run, I don't know, 45, 50 miles a week, 80, 90 kilometers a week. And that's what I did into my 40s. And I think as you get a little bit older, I had a reasonable amount of success. I was a good kind of club county runner, and really enjoyed it. Made a great group of friends, and it became my life really. But I got frustrated with training as I got older and started slowing down, and found out the reason I really competed was just to kind of measure my success really each year, to set new PBs and see how the training was going. And much as I enjoyed racing, it's really a race against yourself, as I'm sure you know, because you've run yourself. And as you slow down, I kind of lost interest really in marking the decline in my running ability. And that combined with a health issue, which we can talk about a little bit later, I kind of concluded that I needed to find something new in my mid-40s, somewhere where I'd got no preconceived ideas about what success meant. And in 2003, I'd been on holiday in Barbados, and I'd seen two guys who'd rowed the Atlantic, and they were part of the Atlantic rowing race. And I kind of said to my wife, that kind of looks like a neat idea, and then forgot about it until 4 or 5 years later, when the idea cropped up again, and decided to have a crack at rowing the Atlantic. So that's how I kind of made my way to rowing. It was really just looking for a new challenge. I'd never rowed before. I'm only 5'7". I'm not your typical Olympic 2,000 meter rower for sure. But the whole endurance element of ocean rowing kind of appealed to me.
Now, when you started to get into that, did you join like a rowing club, and what was the training like for that?
No, I trained very seriously as a runner, and 3 times a day for probably 8 or 9 years in my kind of early 20s through to my early 30s, then twice a day surrounding that. And so I kind of understood endurance training. And when I did eventually decide to row an ocean, I bought myself a training scull, and I live in Canada, and we have a family cottage on a lake. I bought a training scull, bought an Olympic training manual, took it up to the lake with me, and taught myself to row basically from the training manual. And I mean, it's not an easy process at first to get used to. There's a lot of coordination, and your knees are always in the way, getting clattered about, and just not understanding that even a very, very light chop on a lake in a scull is difficult to manage. The blades are always getting caught, and so I flapped about for a couple of years and developed what I think is a pretty decent stroke. I'm sure if anybody who knew anything about rowing looked at it, they'd laugh at me, but it was good enough to put in some serious training leading up to the row. And the issue really is that you can't replicate the geometry of an ocean rowing boat anywhere else apart from on the ocean. But I did enjoy I enjoyed rowing on the lake, and it's the closest thing actually that I've come to the enjoyment I get from my running. Rowing on the lake at 5:30 in the morning as the sun's coming up and the mist's on the lake, it's a pretty cool thing to do. Yeah.
Now, with the Atlantic row, what year was that? Was that 2011?
2011, 2012. So the Atlantic season is to row is between December, leaving the Canaries between December and January. There's a couple of things about I mean, I set off like a lot of people in the ocean rowing world, never been to sea before. You set off and do it, and you do as much research as you can, but you miss little things. And I actually don't consider that I rowed the Atlantic anymore, because I rowed from the Canaries to Barbados, which in itself is still a cool achievement. But the reason when I did the Pacific, I did it land to land, i.e. continent to continent, is because that's really what I consider to be a true ocean crossing. So I consider I really did an ocean passage on the Atlantic.
Yeah, that's like I can't fathom. It's good for the resume, definitely. Ocean rower.
Absolutely, there aren't that many about.
Yeah.
When I did the there's statistics mean nothing really, because the same. I was saying before about when I ran, and when I started to slow down, I realised that the only reason I raced was just to test myself. And both these rows have been about exactly the same thing, really, just proving to yourself what you're capable of, and there's lots of statistics. One of the statistics that everybody banded about up to kind of 2012, because it's not quite true anymore, was there'd been more people in space than had rowed an ocean, and so it's not. I guess if you want to shine in a sport, find one where there aren't many competitors.
Well, when I was doing some research on yourself for this interview, I was trying to fathom, like I've obviously never rowed an ocean or climbed Mount Everest, but you could probably put you in the same league as Edmund Hillary, the first person to have rowed the Pacific Ocean. It's the physical and the mental struggles that you went through, most people can't comprehend.
Yeah, so here's my take on that. I find it quite difficult because I did both these rows for very personal reasons. I'm not doing it like I said, I'm doing it to prove to myself what I'm capable of, not to prove to anybody else anything. I've shared the story, and at first I wasn't comfortable doing that, but people wanted to know where I was. I got family commitments, so I started doing the blog so everybody knew I was okay. And then it kind of gains its own momentum, and the story becomes not your own to a certain extent. But when I set out across the Pacific, I knew it was a big challenge, and I was trying to do a world first. But I wouldn't have dared put myself in that same kind of bracket as Hillary or Shackleton or those guys that, in my mind, were true adventurers. But as I got into, lots of people have said that exactly the same thing. In fact, a really cool guy, a mountaineer from Holland, sent me a nice message when I'd finished, saying, "I've been up Everest, but that's not a patch on what you've done," and that kind of helps me put it in perspective in a sense. I got massive respect for the guys in that league, like I say, Hillary, Shackleton, Scott, all those kind of guys. But as I got into the trip, and it got more and more challenging, way more challenging than I ever thought it was going to be, I could I think I started to understand that those guys were probably not dissimilar to me in the sense that they were just normal guys who did something extraordinary. And if I'm willing to accept any kind of praise or accolades for doing what I did, it would be that I'm an ordinary guy who put his mind to something and did something extraordinary. But I still find it uncomfortable talking about myself in the same. I can remember as a 6-7-year-old sat in my grandparents' house reading an encyclopedia with a picture of Hillary and Tenzing at the top of Everest, and thinking, those guys were, superstars. But it's difficult.
Were those guys or those sort of adventurers people that you looked up to when you were growing up?
Well, I hadn't thought about this for years until somebody asked me in when we were getting the boat ready in San Francisco. And lots of people, as you're getting the boat ready, lots of people come up and want to chat and what are you doing? And that's a kind of cool looking boat and whatever. So, you do your bit and be polite and share your story. And this one lady said, "Have you always been an adventurer?" And I said, "No." And she, "Well, what drives you to do this?" And it got me thinking about when I was young and seeing these pictures in the encyclopedia. And I guess in a sense, without really understanding at the time, it must have impacted me. And deep down, I have this adventurous spirit, which I think, most runners probably do. So I would say yes, they did influence me. and I loved all those stories and the old black and white movies and stuff, and they do have an impact on you. And I think subconsciously, that's kind of there when you set out on these adventures.
Now, with the Atlantic crossing, how long did that take you, and what was the distance?
So I rode 2,750, give or take, nautical miles. It took me 53 days. I was 49, arrived just before my 50th birthday, and I actually set the second fastest time on record, which kind of blew me away a little bit. But it's part of the reason that I did the Pacific. I'd set off to do the Atlantic, not knowing what to expect in a sense. Like I said, I'd never been to sea before. The boat that I had built was built by a specific boat builder that I was desperate to have build a boat. The schedule was really tight. We picked it up 10 days before we drove down to Cadiz to catch the ferry to the Canaries. So I'd never sea trialed the boat because of the way things unravelled on the Canaries. The first time I really went to sea, other than moving the boat 2 miles from one marina to another, was when I left to head for Barbados. And I decided to do the Atlantic because I'd had some health concerns as well in about 2007, 2008. I've been diagnosed with a bicuspid aortic valve, which meant it's a mechanical issue as opposed to heart disease, but it meant I had to have open heart surgery, and that ended up being scheduled for 2009 and 2010, and 15 months later I set off across the Atlantic. So there was part of the reason that I decided to do the Atlantic was because of the operation. I wanted something bigger than the operation to focus on, and I wanted to be in good shape when I went in for the operation so I could come out, start training properly as soon as I got out. When you were diagnosed with this heart condition, what were you thinking? Did you think that that's it? No more running for me? No, it's game over? I don't know what I was really thinking. I was thinking, so my first question to my cardiologist was, so what happens is that because you've only got 2 leaflets instead of 3 on your aortic valve, it starts to stiffen. And because it stiffens, it narrows and lets less blood through. A normal aortic valve opens to 3.5 square centimeters. By the time I had my operation, mine was 0.7 of a centimeter. So I asked the question of my cardiologist, when did it start happening? He said, as soon as your heart matures, it starts stiffening. So from your late teens, early 20s. So by the time I was running at my best in my late 20s, early 30s, this was already affecting me. So the first thing I thought was, what times could I have run if I hadn't have had this heart condition? And so that was the first thing that crossed my mind. And I didn't have that conversation with him, but I did later have a conversation with him about how it would affect my athletic ambitions that I had left. And he kind of said, well, what are they? And I said, well, I've always fancied running John O'Groats to Land's End and then possibly running across Canada. And he said, I don't think you should be doing that. And we did have a separate conversation about, well, how much are you running at the moment? And when I told him I was running 80 or 90 kilometers, only running 80 or 90 kilometers a week, he nearly had a heart attack. But that's a slightly different story. So he wasn't that keen on me taking on these big running challenges. And but then I kind of slipped into the conversation, well, what about rowing an ocean? And he for some reason, he didn't object to that. I think because it's non-weight bearing. Well, possibly because it's non-weight bearing, or possibly because he thought, well, this guy is completely crazy. There's no way he's ever going to do that. And so he said, well, maybe that's not such a big a deal. Sorry, as kind of running across Canada. And but because of that, he actually suggested that I had this specific heart operation called the Ross procedure, which is it's not the usual solution to the problem I had at my age. It's used for younger patients or very active people. And basically what they do is that they take your own pulmonary valve and replace your aortic valve with that, and then they replace your pulmonary valve with a cadaver valve. Now, obviously, they're playing about with 2 valves, so they wouldn't do it if it was heart disease or So they obviously doubles the risk. But anyway, so it means I don't have to have any medication, and hopefully we'll never have to go back in for a repeat operation. So I had the operation, went well. I was out of hospital in 5 days. I walked in the day that I got out to the end of the drive and back, but within 3 weeks I was walking 12 miles a day. 6 weeks I started very light running. 8 weeks later I was back on the water, and then I was focused on getting to the Atlantic. Having done that, and then to be the second fastest ever, regardless of age, across the Atlantic, was a pretty cool achievement, really. And but I'd gone into the Atlantic thinking it was going to be the biggest challenge of a lifetime, push me right to the edge and test me. And I knew even before I finished the Atlantic that I hadn't. It was hard. Every day was physically hard, and mentally quite hard as well. But I hadn't come close to that edge where you think, I can't get up tomorrow, I can't carry on. How am I going to, get to the other side? And so even before I finished the Atlantic, I knew that I was looking for something. I still hadn't found that challenge that I could step off the boat and say, right, I'm happy that I've achieved something phenomenal.
Sorry, after that point, were you, what options were going through your mind sort of coming towards the end of the Atlantic crossing? Were you contemplating straight up the Pacific crossing, or were there other major sort of adventures you were thinking?
No, not really. I'd had a few inquiries for the boat before I'd even got to the other side. I sold the boat I sold the boat. It was put back in a container, shipped back to the UK, which is where it was built. A guy met me on the dock. We unloaded the boat, and he gave me a check and took it away. And the idea behind selling the boat was to stop me doing anything stupid again. But I already knew that I needed something else. And the neat thing about selling the boat was it gave me the opportunity to go back and say to the boat builder, this worked, this didn't. We need to change the steering system. I had a list of about 48, mainly small changes, but 48 things that we redesigned slightly. And it gave me the chance to build a new boat. But within 6 weeks, I'd already found the Pacific and decided that's what I was going to do. I had to put it off for a couple of years because of some work commitments that came up, and eventually got off last. It was just nearly a year ago now, May, the end of May.
Now, your boat, the Sox 2, was that developed or built by the same guy who did the Atlantic?
Yeah, boat? Absolutely. So Jamie Fabrizio, the boat builder's name, absolutely incredible boat builder who doesn't build boats anymore. He started off his life in his youth building model aircraft, and he kind of brought that same attention to detail to his boat building. Absolutely unbelievable, the skill, and his patience and his endurance building the boats equal to mine rowing it, really. But he I think he found it quite difficult having people at sea in his boats, even though they were incredibly safe. And I wouldn't go to sea in anybody else's boat. But he found that quite difficult having people's lives. He felt in his hands, in a sense, and so he was always very nervous when people are at sea. So he stopped building boats. I believe he's building carbon fiber bikes now, but because he loves his cycling. Yeah, so a pretty cool guy, designed by a naval architect called Phil Morrison.
And just give us an overview of the boat itself. Was there like a keel? I'm guessing there was no.
Yeah.
Was there like a sail for like just in case, or what?
No.
What?
Okay, so first thing is it's rowing, right? So I'm a bit strange. The ocean rowing world's pretty diverse. There's no world governing body. There is an association called the Ocean Rowing Society, who are self-appointed arbiters of everything ocean rowing, but they have some strange. It's just a private club, basically. So my take on ocean rowing is it should be rowing. The boat should be as close to a traditional ocean rowing boat, kind of the tenders for the HMS Victory and the old sailing boats back in the 1800s. So they have a skeg, they can have a rudder. A lot of people go to sea with autopilots. I consider that cheating in a sense, because you 25-30% of your effort goes into steering the boat when you don't have an autopilot. I think you need to make concessions for safety, so GPS and for navigation, water makers, those kind of things. But mechanically, so like running, it's a test of your physical and mental endurance. Anything you do to kind of cheat that test, in my opinion, lessens the challenge. And I wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't want to invest that much time, money, and effort in doing something and then feel, well, I kind of cheated a bit really because I had an autopilot. And as for a sail, I wouldn't even dry a pair of shorts above the boat line because that's sailing, not rowing. So you have a skeg, you have a rudder, which is controlled by two hand lines basically, and a GPS, as I say. But the GPS is kind of for day-to-day navigation. The actual minute-to-minute navigation is done by a magnetic compass. Because the boat's so short, the GPS never can work out which way the boat's pointing. But it gives you speed, and as I say, it plots your course over longer periods of time. And then you can make bearing adjustments throughout the day. Yeah.
And what's a skeg?
Oh, the skeg is like a keel, but it's it starts at nothing at the front and kind of widens towards the back of the boat, towards the rudder. So it just helps the boat run straight in big weather. That's all.
You had spare oars?
I had 6 oars, yeah. They're Kevlar oars with a rosewood handle, so they're pretty cool and expensive.
So how much was the boat? Did you buy that yourself or fund it yourself, or did you get sponsorship?
Yeah, so I'm self-financed. I don't look for sponsorship because I don't like the whole... Again, it's well, I don't understand why anybody'd pay for me to go on an adventure. I understand why somebody might pay me now I've achieved something to come and speak or do whatever. But it baffles me why somebody would want to pay for a guy who's going to get very little exposure in a sense to go row an ocean. So I'm self-financed. The boat cost about it was in pounds, so it probably cost about $120,000, and then your bits of equipment and stuff, you can add another $30,000 onto that. So it's not an inexpensive thing to do. A poor boy made good, basically, and I'm fortunate that I could afford to do it. The other thing about not having sponsors is that you're in total control. You make the decisions, and on a project like this, you really need to be in control and not have those external pressures making you think twice about where you leave from. I left from San Francisco, which is a pretty cool place to leave from, rode under the Golden Gate Bridge, but because of the tides, I left at midnight. So it was, we've got 3 pictures of a tiny little light going under the bridge. And, if I had sponsors, I'm sure they wouldn't have been happy with that. But it was technically the right thing to do.
I just want to ask about, I guess, the logistics around food. How much food could you store in the boat, and how did you calculate that you needed X amount of food?
Yes, I understood. So when I did the Atlantic, I spoke to a few people who rowed before, and coming from a running background, we're all pretty well versed in nutrition, and I've been running for 35 years, I guess, and so you kind of understand your body's needs. And a number of people had said, "Oh, you need 6,000 calories a day." So what I did on the Atlantic was I planned at 6,000 calories a day, and weighed myself before I went, came back, weighed myself when I got back, took the inventory of food, what I'd used, and we calculated I only burned 4,200 calories a day. And that's partly due to being a bit older. You burn less calories each decade. You once you're out of your 20s, you burn 100 calories a day less. I'm only 5'7", 140 pounds. So again, you burn a bit less than somebody who would be 6 foot, whatever. And so that's what I used to calculate my food for the Pacific. So it was more accurate, really. And we thought I could get there in somewhere between 130 and 180 days. So I provisioned for 180 days. Because of the speed of my Atlantic crossing, we were all a bit cocky, I guess. And nobody thought it was going to take me 180 days. So anyway, I provisioned for 180 days. About 50% of the food is dehydrated expedition type food. Take a jet boil and boil a cup of water, mix it, leave it, and so it's quite nice. Lots of curries and whatever else, porridge in the morning, and then the rest is biscuits and chocolate and kind of high calorie, simple sugar stuff, so you can eat and get quick calories.
And you also mentioned a water maker. What's the process of removing the salt?
Yeah, so it's a reverse osmosis machine. It's the most expensive piece of kit and the most critical piece of kit on the boat, really. Even if you lost your navigation, you could still make your way to safety and in various ways. But if you lose the water maker, you have a backup manual water maker, but they burn nearly as you lose as much moisture when you're pumping the thing as you're making nearly. So it's a reverse osmosis. It sucks salt water in. It filters out the salt and leaves some water in with that and spits it out as brine, and then produces clear, virtually tasteless water. Actually,
Is that like an automated process, or is it a manual thing?
Well, you run the machine every day. So the boat has quite sophisticated. I mean, it uses quite a bit of power for your navigation, lights, water maker, charging up other bits and pieces. So you have solar panels on the boat, 2 big 85 amp hour batteries, and the water maker again was the most power hungry piece of kit. But being a solo rower, this thing would make 30 litres in an hour, and I only ever use 15 or 20 litres a day.
So when you headed off out underneath the Golden Gate, maybe give us an insight into the next sort of couple of weeks, as you started to leave the North American mainland.
Yeah.
What's the ocean like? Is there like a continental shelf?
There is, and the most difficult part of most ocean rowing trips is when you're close to a body of land, and leaving San Francisco is quite difficult because there is a big shelf that runs out to about 80 or 90 miles in places, and the water's 250, 300, 400 feet deep, which is quite shallow, and because of the topography of the land. There's lots of weird currents in there. You've also got for the first few days, you've got the draw of the San Francisco Bay. As the tide comes in, it sucks all that water in, which creates, combined with this shallow shelf, creates very, very difficult rowing conditions. And then you also have the afternoon onshore winds. Because the landmass is so huge, sun shines on the land in the morning, warms up, heat rises, and then it sucks the wind onshore every day, and that the reach of that katabatic effect is pretty reaches far out. So getting away from the coast there is incredibly difficult. I also left, and within 36 hours, bad weather approached. I was trying to get a certain distance before the bad weather approached, and just didn't quite manage to get there because of the effect of the wind and the currents. So I had to suffer for 3 or 4 days just crabbing down the coast, and that went on for three weeks. Very foggy, very cold. The sea temperature is only about 48 degrees, but the air temperature is quite hot, and that's where all the big fogs come from in California. And so very difficult to navigate, very busy shipping lanes, so you've got to keep an eye out for all that. And you have a special, there's a special piece of equipment called an AIS, an automated information system, which uses a VHF frequency to send a signal, and all commercial shipping has to do the same. So you can see boats in your area, which way they're going, how fast they're going, and they can see you. Well, they can at least supposedly see you, because I'm so tiny. Sometimes they think their GPS is giving them false signals, but yeah. So yeah.
With the actual traffic and all the cargo ships, and is that throughout the whole Pacific?
No, mainly up. So off the coast of the US, everything it goes up and down, up to about probably 200 miles out, I guess. From South America all the way up the coast to all the big major US cities. So once you get past that, you don't see a lot. As you're approaching, I dropped quite a long way east of Hawaii, but saw some shipping kind of heading for Hawaii. And then once I dropped below Hawaii, I didn't see anything else again. The next time I saw a ship, I think I was the other side of the equator. So once you get out of those main shipping lanes, and then approaching Australia again, I saw more traffic there.
Was there ever a risk of pirates at all?
Not really. I guess there is. I'm not sure why unless they kind of they wanted to capture me for ransom, but all my money had been spent on the boat, so they wouldn't have got very much.
Yeah.
and it's not like the boat was stacked full of riches, unless you consider the freeze-dried food riches. Yeah. So there wouldn't have been much point in that. But it's not. I mean, the areas I went through, that's more off the coast of Africa. So if you did the Indian Ocean, that would be more of a challenge.
Now, as you approach the equator, how did the currents change and the wind? Is there sort of much? What's that like? Well,
so the story about the weather is partly because, as I said before, I'm self-financed. So I have work commitments, and my wife kindly took over most of my work commitments, but I had to get to a certain stage in the year, and it meant that the earliest I could leave was June 1st. And so in reality, I could have done with leaving 3 or 4 or even 5 or 6 weeks earlier. I headed down to like I say, east of Hawaii and dropped down underneath Hawaii. And unlike the Atlantic, which was a trade winds route, which means that you kind of picking up the natural, the same way Columbus discovered the West Indies, you're picking up the natural currents and wind direction. They say if you throw a bottle in the Canaries, 120 days later it'll wash up somewhere in the Caribbean. So that's what's called a trade winds route, because it's not like you're on a magic carpet or anything, but you do get help from the conditions. To get across the equator and to get to Australia, I had to cut diagonally across the trade winds, so I didn't get the same amount of help. So I could have done with leaving a little bit earlier. As I kind of dropped below Hawaii, there were 4 big hurricanes scooted up to my east. And even though they were 600-800 miles away from me, they still affected the weather where I was. So it made even getting down to the equatorial current, the northern equatorial current, really difficult. So I struggled with the weather a lot, even just approaching what's called the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone. And that's really a big 1,200-mile strip around the equator, which is the equatorial current, which runs west in the northern hemisphere, then the equator, and the equatorial countercurrent, which runs east back towards South America, and that runs east at 3.5, 4 knots sometimes, and it'll just drag you back to Peru or Chile or wherever, and then you drop down through that across the equator, as I say, and then down to the equatorial current in the southern hemisphere, which runs west again. So it creates all these weird swirling currents. That whole area is massively difficult to get through. I'd had these hurricanes, which had really slowed me down. I had a couple of days where I was actually in the northern equatorial current and made some really good mileage, and thought, everything's good. And then the ITCZ is also in parts called the doldrums. Now the doldrums kind of make you think that not a lot's going to happen, that it's very calm and flat water, and but what you find when you're actually there is that the equator and this ITCZ is where all the world's storm clouds meet, basically, and it's really unpredictable. And you can get, especially in the afternoons with the convection effect, the heat on the water, you get, they're called squalls, but they're proper full-blown 20, 25 knot storms. They only last for 4 or 5 hours. But they're nevertheless in a little rowing boat. That's it's a big blow, especially if it's not going your way. So I'd done reasonably well by the time I got to the equatorial current in the northern hemisphere, and I started dropping down towards crossing the equatorial countercurrent, going the wrong way. But then the wind changed, started coming from the southwest, and it blew me back 350 nautical miles, so about 500 kilometers. So if you imagine if you're in a race, an endurance race or whatever, you get to 50 miles, you get to 60 miles, all of a sudden the wind starts blowing, and then you find yourself back at 40 miles and you have to rerun that. So that's what it was like.
Was that
mentally?
Was that heartbreaking mentally?
Oh, mentally, it's the toughest thing I've ever done in my entire life, which may sound like it's a no-brainer statement, but to actually be in that position where it's like somebody's sticking their hand in your pocket and robbing you, and every day that you row and sometimes you'd row for 4 or 5 hours and make half a mile, and then you'd stop because you were desperate to eat, drink, or visit the head, and in the 5 minutes that you stopped, you'd lose 1.5 miles. So you were rowing on the spot, which is better than going backwards, but soul destroying, absolutely soul destroying. And by the time don't forget, by the time I get down to the equator, I'm already kind of 3 or 4 weeks behind the schedule that I thought I should be on. So that's mentally quite difficult. And this is, so going back to our very early conversation about Hillary and those guys, that's really when I started thinking, well, this is a proper challenge. This is not, I'm not flying across the Atlantic and making it look easy. This is, proper serious 15 hours rowing. And sometimes in the ITCZ, the only way to get out of these currents was to row for 28, 30, 32 hours with just trying to get 2, maybe 20-minute cat naps, and just row until you broke out of whatever the adverse current was. And then you get a little break, and then you'd have to do the same again. And so a good night's sleep was 3 or 4 hours. But there were a number of occasions where I just had to find the energy to row and use whatever tricks you can, really, to keep yourself awake, and coffee and ginger nut biscuits and whatever else.
At night, what do you do when you stop for the day?
Yeah.
The ocean's that deep, you can't put an anchor down. What do? Do you just sort of float?
Yeah. So outside of the ITCZ, these 28, 30-hour days when everything was going backwards, a normal day would be rowing somewhere between 13.5 and 15 hours a day. And I'd do that in somewhere between 3 and 5 hour stints. So I'd eat, row, prepare food again, eat, and row again. And then when I finished at night, I'd get cleaned up, I'd write my blog, settle down, and you just let the boat drift, and you try and take advantage of whatever conditions there are, to hopefully you drift in the right direction. Quite often you drift not in the right direction, and you have a thing called a sea anchor, which is a big parachute. Now this works by tossing the thing over the side, it opens out and it locks you into the water. If the wind's blowing the wrong way, it will hold you against the wind so you won't go backwards. If the current's going the wrong way, you're locked in the water, so you'll go the way that the current's going. And they're the days that you have to just keep rowing until you break out of that adverse current. So you have a bit of defense against the wind, and you try and plot your route so you do take advantage of some of the conditions. But it was massively challenging and sometimes, I mean, there are things that I ran into in the Pacific that I'd never even heard of in the Atlantic, which are anti-clockwise rotating currents, that kind of thing, where the water just goes crazy, and this, it's like a whirlpool going anti-clockwise, and it spits out currents in all directions like a Catherine wheel, the firework. So you can imagine if you're on the wrong side of that and it's pushing you backwards, incredibly difficult to escape from. And I ran into a couple of those in the Southern Hemisphere after I'd crossed the equator, and they cost me a week or 10 days each, which didn't help my arrival schedule.
Now, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, are there any massive breaking waves at all?
Yeah, well, waves tend to break backwards at sea. So when you're on a beach, the friction of the beach grabs hold of the bottom of the wave and holds it back, and then the water's moving along the top, and that's why waves break forwards on the beach. At sea, there is no friction underneath the waves. So the waves build up because the water's pushing along, and then they tend to break. The white water goes backwards if they're big enough, and so it's not quite like you'd think of a large wave. But yeah, the waves get quite big. I didn't have any big storms on the Pacific like I had on the Atlantic. I got caught in a couple of big 35, 40 knot storms with 18, 20 foot waves. I would say the biggest waves on the Pacific were probably 15 feet, but that's still nearly 2 stories when you're in your little boat looking up at them. They're big old waves. But if they're going your way, it's quite good fun rowing, and you can actually, if you can time it right, and as you're approaching the top of the wave, if the wave breaks backwards, that white frothy water will pick you up and you'll surf at 10, 12, 15 knots. Just for a few seconds, and that's really exhilarating, and so pretty cool if they're going your way.
And when they're not going your way, is it just hold on?
You just
try and ride it out.
Yeah, well, going your way. So it's a bit like the drifting thing at night. You're trying to go in the right direction, but your course is a pretty loose thing in the middle of the ocean. So you can't fight the weather completely. So sometimes you have to take the least worst route you can, and then make up for it later on when the weather changes. And that's the same. If you can't, the best thing to do is not to fight the weather, to try and get as close to your course as you can, but to make safe decisions. Still doesn't mean that the boat's not being swamped every 60 or 80, 90 seconds, and you're soaking wet through, getting knocked off your seat, and the boat's full up to the scuppers, and which is frustrating because it's obviously the boat's heavier, then more difficult to move. You try not to fight it too much, but it can be intimidating.
Did a wave ever knock you out of the boat at all?
Oh, not out of the boat. No, the boat has handrails, and that's also where my spare oars are lashed. The boat's pretty safe. If the weather, so I'm always strapped into the boat. I have a surf leash. Well, I say it always. In calm conditions, I wouldn't wear the surf leash if I'm honest. But if the weather was anything other than calm, I'd have the leash on. And if it got really bad, this only happened a couple of times, I'd wear my life jacket, and I had a harness strap on the life jacket, but still be at the oars. So no, never went over the side, other than a couple of times intentionally to clean the bottom of the boat.
Did the boat ever roll at all, like in a big storm?
No, they are designed to self-right, and so if they do capsize, and rowing boats have capsized at sea, but they do right themselves because of the way they're designed. But again, that's kind of, in my humble opinion, that's part of your kind of seamanship to make sure you don't put the boat in a position where it would roll. I mean, if it was a massive sea, sometimes and a cross sea, for example, you could get yourself into trouble. But where you can, you try to run with the weather, and that would generally stop you. And I had a drogue on the boat, so I could fly a drogue from the back of the boat, which keeps you downwind. So you have to make good decisions, basically, when you're at sea. That's the secret to staying alive.
On those days when it's fairly calm, did you go swimming much?
Oh no, so I'm not a big. I'm solo, so a lot of my. I've met quite a lot of ocean rowers. Most people do this as a team of 2 or 4, and they all say, "Oh, you need to swim, and you need to," but they've got somebody to stand on the boat and look for the big grey shadow, right? When you're on your own, I did go over the side twice to clean the barnacles off the bottom of the boat, and but you're in and out as quick as you can because you've got no idea. And once I started seeing sharks, which was just before the equator, I didn't go over the side of the boat again. I had a telescopic camera pole that I strapped my scraper to, and I scraped the bottom of the boat hanging over the side. And so no, I didn't swim, much as it looked really tempting. But there's some big beasties in there.
So just on the sharks and the wildlife, what were there? Was it like a big school of sharks? And what other wildlife did you see?
I saw loads of stuff, and one of the big treats of doing something like this is the wildlife. And the interesting thing is that the wildlife just sees the boat as floating debris. and little fish come and hide underneath it. Big fish come to eat the little fish, and so I saw sharks, dolphins, marlin. I had some big blue marlin, and 2 or 3 times a big 20, 30 pound tuna would be hiding under the boat because the marlin was chasing it, and the marlin had circled the boat. So you kind of stood inches away really from the circle of life stuff going on around the boat, and they completely ignore you, not interested in you at all. The interesting thing about sharks, I did have a few occasions where I thought, oh, I've got 6 or 7 sharks around the boat, and I used my GoPro to film underwater. And when I got back and actually looked at the footage, there were actually 30 or 40 sharks down there. So you obviously can't see them all the time, but they're big schools. And the interesting thing off Vanuatu, when I rode past Vanuatu, I did a resupply because I ran out of food. I stayed at sea, and I rode close to the island, and my shore support brought out a food resupply for me, so I could continue on the non-stop nature of the trip. And but I had dolphins and marlin, but this one particular day I had a huge school of dolphin, but a huge school of sharks as well, and they were mixed together, which was, I didn't think dolphins and sharks kind of shared territory.
They weren't attacking each other? It was just sort of...
No, they were just... the dolphins didn't seem intimidated at all. I know dolphins can defend themselves against sharks, but they were swimming in the same water and as oblivious to each other, which is interesting.
And did you fish at all?
No, so I spent my time rowing 15 hours a day. A few reasons you wouldn't fish. One, I'm on my own. 2, you're not going to catch anything small. And what you're going to do with it when you've caught it, you can only eat a certain amount in the first 24 hours, I guess. I guess you could mess about drying it. But the other thing is, if you pull something big over the side, there'd be blood and snot all over the place, and you've got mess, and then there's the time, and so freeze-dried food. I mean, I saw some cool tuna, massive tuna jumping out by the boat, 100, 200 pound tuna and stuff, especially as I started approaching Australia within the last kind of 800-900 miles, I guess. There was some huge tuna. Yeah, pretty cool.
I've also heard, seen documentaries and stuff, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Did you see much garbage out there at all?
I saw a little bit of stuff north of Hawaii. Didn't see anything south of Hawaii. Little bits when I crossed the equator, as I was kind of passing through but it was small amounts of stuff really. I nearly ran into a huge gas bottle one day, but that's just one single thing that's got blown off a deck somewhere. So I didn't see the plastic island. But my little trail through that massive wilderness was nothing really. It makes you feel not insignificant, but it's just a huge body of water, and as I say, my little line. I saw more waste on the Atlantic than I did on the Pacific.
Did you ever get like a spiritual connection to the ocean? Particularly when it might be like a real sort of calm day and you're looking from horizon to horizon, a full 360-degree view, and not seeing anything on the horizon or anything except for the expanse of water. Did you?
I think doing something like this kind of connects you to yourself in a sense. I'm not, I'm not religious, and never have been, but the word spiritual is something that I would say, yes, I experience that more often than not at night. So you're rowing in the dark quite a lot, and especially in the southern hemisphere after I cross the equator, because the southern hemisphere points more at the center of the Milky Way. There are more stars, or you can see more stars in the southern hemisphere. The night sky's just mind-boggling when it's clear, and you do feel an incredible sense of calm, and but a connection to nature in a sense that you don't feel when you're on land, and you're also thousands of miles from anywhere. One of my friends sent me an email saying, you do realise the closest person to you is in the space station 250 kilometres above your head, which is that was a bit close. yeah. So yes, I would say, yeah, and you get, although your mind's very busy all the time and navigating and coping with that day's problems, and you do get a lot of time to think, and I think there's, you realise the value of family and friends, but family especially, and it makes you realise. Sorry, go on.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, did you draw on, your family and your kids for inspiration and to get you through those tough times?
Yeah, I had physically, I never doubted that I could get there. I knew I could get there. I was concerned about the running out of time because I'd got work commitments, and I ended up being 6 weeks later than I thought I would be. And but there were a couple of times. So when I dropped around Hawaii would have been a logical place if I was going to quit. I would have done so, and because I'd had to put this off a couple of years. When my eldest daughter had just graduated from high school while I was away, heading off to university. My wife was coping with my work. She's coping with, my daughter going to university, as I said, and I kind of felt like a bit of a crappy father and husband, really, and I did consider quitting in Hawaii for that reason, but they told me that I shouldn't be stupid and I'd put all this effort in, and they made lots of sacrifice and that I should just get on with it, basically, and I did, but it was a serious concern at the time. Also, Vanuatu, when I did the resupply, that would have been another place to stop, and for a number of reasons. One, I'd rode for about 3 weeks by the time I got to Vanuatu with a broken rib, and that had been quite difficult. But I was up because I was late. I was really heading into the cyclone season, and I didn't. Obviously, it's not recommended that you get caught in a cyclone, and that's what happened in 1983 to Peter Bird, and so it was a bit of a risk pushing on from Vanuatu, and but it was an El Nino year, and El Nino suppress the cyclone season for a little bit longer usually. So we kind of took a calculated risk. Now, in retrospect, it was a pretty close call because in my last 10 days approaching Australia, there was a cyclone forming in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which, if it hadn't have fizzled out, would have come around the top of Australia and pushed me back offshore. So it was a pretty close call, really. Oh, when you're rowing at sea, the water's uneven at either side of the boat, and you're pulling away on the oars, and quite often a blade will get caught in the water and it'll jab you in the ribs, and it happened. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes your hands would ram together, and the backs of my hands were quite knocked about for the entire trip. But at other times you'd get a dig in the ribs, and it always hurt. And you shake it off and you carry on. And I did that on this one particular day, and when I got my head down for my 3 or 4 hours, got up and tried to row the next day, and it's typical broken rib symptoms of not being able to put any pressure on that side at all. So I had to row cockeyed for the best part of a month, really. Ended up taking a few painkillers, but I'm not a big fan of tablets, so I kind of developed a weird rowing style where I push more with my one leg than the other, and just kind of clung on to the oar. But yeah, so but we spoke about Everest and other things. One of the things that appeals to me about ocean rowing is that once you're out in the middle of the ocean, there is no, Everest, you kind of get guided up by the Sherpas, guide you up, and if you're running a marathon and you're struggling, you can jump on a local transport, and St. John's will take you to the end, whatever. But once you're out in the middle of the ocean, there is no way out. So you have to find a solution to whatever problem you have, and that's part of the appeal, really. And yeah, and what I hadn't found on the Atlantic was I hadn't found that difficulty where I thought, how do I get through this? But with the Pacific, there were so many challenges added together. The whole ITCZ thing, going backwards 500 kilometers, broken ribs and smashed hands and whatever else that I did actually find what I was looking for.
What other injuries did you have to battle through? You would have got extreme blisters on your hands, or did they just become super calloused?
Yeah, no, my hands were pretty tough when I left, and the calluses did get worse. On top of my, I'm laughing about this, but I shouldn't really. On top of my heart operation, I've also got rheumatoid arthritis, and so I'm living proof that it doesn't matter what life throws at you, you can go out there and achieve something big, right? And so my hands are pretty claw-like anyway, perfect for rowing. And as long as I take the medication, I have to take medication for that. I don't for my heart, but I can cope with the stiffness. I'm usually a bit stiff when I set off in the morning, but that kind of things would loosen up as you go. So that was more of a problem than the calluses. But because of the way my hands have been the last few years, the calluses formed in a kind of strange way. So for a few weeks they were a bit uncomfortable. So, but in general, my palms were fine. But it's the backs of your hands where the oar handles smash together in rough conditions, where you'd break the skin and it'd try and heal. You'd just start to get it to heal, and then it'd get broken open again and again and again. And the salt water is really corrosive. So my hands were a bit of a mess.
I'm guessing the repetitive rowing motion, did that change your physique at all?
Oh, no, massively. So as I said at the beginning, you can't really train for the geometry of the boat because you sat a little bit higher. The oars are much heavier than on the training scull, and on the training scull, you're kind of 3 inches above the water, and the oars are virtually straight out from the side of the boat. In the ocean boat, you're a little bit higher. The geometry is different. The oars are heavier. The boat weighs nearly a ton. 2,500 pounds, whatever, so it's a heavy piece of kit. Even though when you get following weather, it makes it a bit easier. So yeah, by the time you've been at sea for 3 or 4 weeks, you have loads of new muscle groups popping up in your back, and most runners don't have much of an upper body, but I definitely had one of those when I arrived.
Did you ever get seasick at all?
No, so again, one of my funny stories is that whenever I'd been to sea before I did the Atlantic, sea fishing or whatever, I get horrendously seasick. So I was quite concerned about that, and I got all sorts of remedies, and ginger's quite a good solution for tummy trouble when you're at sea. So ginger biscuits, I had some seasickness ginger tablets, that kind of thing. But seasickness is really just a mental issue where your brain gets confused by the signals it's receiving from the middle ear and from your eyes. But your brain's, much as it's a smart piece of kit, it can only concentrate on one thing at a time. So if you try and count in your head and talk at the same time, you can't do it. And that's a bit like the two different signals from your eyes and your middle ear. So if you distract your mind, and when you sat rowing on the rowing seat and you're navigating, you're in the fresh air as well, which helps. I never even got queasy on either trip. So it's just keeping your mind busy, really. And that's easy to do as a solo rower because you're responsible for everything. You find quite a lot of crews, when they're off shift, they'll go in the cabin and it's hot and sweaty, and they're obviously just laid there rolling about and they get seasick. But I never did. So
as you started to approach Cairns or enter Australian waters, do you need to notify like the Coast Guard or the Navy or anything like that to let them know that you're entering Australian waters, or do you just row into Australia?
No, I just rowed up to the marina. I had my shore support flew out, so I have a team of one basically who helps me. Tony Humphreys, who's he is a proper mariner. He's been involved in lots of rows. He was involved in the Atlantic rowing race from the very beginning when that race was set up, and so he's got lots of experience. He's got a maritime degree, and he's also got his Ocean Yacht Masters ticket as well. So he really has proper ocean going experience. He helped me across the Atlantic as well, and so he flew out to make preparations for me arriving. When I left San Francisco, we notified vessel traffic control. And they sent out a little message to all the traffic every morning, and but we didn't need to do the same coming into Cairns. But he was there in case anything went wrong, and to get through the reef, because we thought this hurricane was coming. Tony arranged for a local sailor to come out. And they shepherded me through the reef for the last couple of days, just in case anything went wrong, because obviously I wouldn't have been able to throw out an anchor. You damage the reef, and they were there to kind of make sure I got through the right channel and didn't run into any bad weather. And I didn't actually. The weather calmed down, and as I kind of cleared the reef on the last morning and came around the little peninsula. The tide started coming in and made life a bit easier. So it was pretty cool, yeah.
And what were your feelings when you were 100 metres away from docking in Cairns? What were you going through?
It was a pretty spectacular morning, really, arriving. We'd had a really, really tough weather conditions for days and days and days. Lots of rain. The wind was coming offshore, so pushing me away from Australia, pushing me southeast for quite, and I had to do a couple of really long days. I did a couple of 20-hour days at the oars, and on the last evening, we decided to get in for the time we wanted to, because my wife had agreed with the press that I'd be in at a certain time. So I only got a couple of hours sleep. Then I rode through the night, and it was still very humid and difficult. And then I came to the peninsula of the Yarrabah Aboriginal Reserve there, and the sun was just starting to come up. The tide started to give me a little bit of help coming in. And as the sun came up, all the mist was hanging in the trees on the beaches and stuff, and it looked absolutely stunning. And as the rowing started to get a little bit easier, I pushed on for the next couple of miles. My wife and two daughters came out to meet me in a boat just before I got in, so we could say our hellos and everything. So once I got to shore, I was at the mercy of the press in a sense. And then I rowed the last kind of 3 miles, and a little flotilla of boats kind of gathered round me, and everybody was hooting and hollering and asking me crazy questions, considering that I'd not really spoken to anybody for 6 months. Was kind of an interesting. And then as I rode in, the welcome in Cairns was incredible. But the sun came out, and it was a glorious day. And it was the first day it had not rained in Cairns for about 10 days, I think. So we got great weather and got a brilliant welcome. And after I'd fulfilled all my obligations, I went with my two daughters, and we had a lemon sorbet, which was the first thing I ate on land, which was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some footage of you on YouTube getting out of the boat and standing on land for the first time after 7 months. What was that like?
It was strange. So I'd been asking people through my blog what I should be saying. You know, it's kind of a big, this thing we talked about being the first person ever to do this, and we'd been joking about trying to come up with something smart to say, one giant step for mankind kind of thing. And no, apart from everybody wanting me to ask you guys what the cricket score was in the summer, they couldn't come up with anything more creative than that. And I kind of had this idea. I don't know whether there's a jockey called Frankie Dettori. I think he's raced a few times in Australia, and he does this fancy dismount when he wins a race. Kind of springs off his saddle and lands by the side of the horse. And I thought, that's what I'll do. When I dock, I'll spring over the handrail and say that was a hell of a ride. So you can see, if you look at the video, when I arrived, I grab hold of the handrail and I bend my knees, and I'm just about to spring over the handrail, and I could feel all the strength drain out of my legs. And I thought better of it. And as I stepped over, you could see my legs just. It's a good job I didn't do it. I nearly fell in the marina without doing the fancy dismount, but so that was quite funny.
And I noticed customs were there straight.
Absolutely, yeah.
Were you thinking, I hope I brought my passport?
Yeah, so I had to go rummaging about for my passport. There was a guy there from environmental control, wanted to bag up all my rubbish straight away, but yeah, so it was kind of cool that the customs came to me. There was a neat little cartoon in the Cairns paper the day after, and it was, I think it was one of your ex-prime ministers saying, I knew we hadn't implemented that turn back policy properly, or something
Right,
like that.
yeah.
So it was pretty cool. It was a great welcome, and I mean, what a relief to get there after 209 days.
It's an incredible achievement.
Pretty cool.
Your first night on land, were you rocking still? Was your mind still?
Yes, your legs are pretty. So I mean, we were saying it before about new muscle growth and your brain coping with seasickness, all that kind of stuff. Your body's an amazing thing, and it can adapt really well. And what happens is that your mind gets used to the boat moving all the time, so it anticipates the ground, in essence, the boat floor moving, and makes allowances for that. And you'd be walking along, and I guess your mind's still thinking, oh, that ground's going to move any second now. And as you put your foot down, your knee will buckle and you'll fall over or wobble or look like you've just staggered out of the nearest bar. And that takes 3 or 4 days to disappear. So you feel quite wobbly for a while, but it goes quite quickly. And we had a busy time actually when we arrived. I mean, 24 hours after arriving, we were on a plane to Sydney, and then 2 days later, we were on a plane back to Canada. So we only had 24 hours to clean the boat, get it ready to be shipped back to Canada.
Do you reckon if you went into any gym in the world, you'd absolutely destroy the rowing machine?
Yeah, well, that's a different kind of rowing. I did start thinking actually that what happens is, so you get all this growth in your back, but your forearms get really strong, and what I did think was I should enter an arm wrestling competition. I'm sure I would have done quite well. I wouldn't do well now, but at the time, I was my arms and forearms were really quite strong. And, I've only rowed once since December 27th.
So have you got anything else planned for the future? Is it just you're just going to chill out for the time being? Well, have you got anything you're working on?
So that's a pretty frequently asked question, and it's quite difficult to answer. There's a few ways of looking at it. One is that if I said no, there's nothing else, on the agenda. That kind of makes me feel like life's over at 54, which I don't think that it is. But then I don't. There was a genuine reason for doing both these trips, right? And we've kind of gone into that. So the first one was to prove that I was still capable and have something big after this heart operation, and because I didn't find the challenge in that, so there was a genuine reason for doing the Pacific. And I, as I've said before, the only reason I did either of these trips was to prove to myself what I was capable of. Now I finished the Pacific, and I don't have the same questions that I had when I finished the Atlantic. So I feel like I've answered those questions. I don't think I should be doing anything else just because other people expect me to do something else. I don't want to do something that feels like it's like I'm doing it for the sake of it, if that makes sense. There needs to be a genuine drive either in me or I'm really enjoying it at the moment. I run with both my girls, and I enjoy doing that. I still kind of have this hankering to maybe run across Canada. And there was a famous guy who did that. He didn't quite make it. He had cancer in the 70s. A guy called Terry Fox, and he started a foundation that's raised millions since he unfortunately died. But it'd be kind of cool to finish that off and try and raise some money for his foundation, I guess. So I do have some ideas. I'm not sure whether it would be any rowing challenge. Because I've just done the biggest ocean in the world, and it's a world first, so I wouldn't particularly want to do anything less challenging, if that makes sense. So it's finding the right thing. I mean, again, as I said, I'm self-financed, so at the moment I've got my head down and working hard, trying to put some money back in the bank. my family's put up with me since 2008, really, talking about rowing oceans, whatever. So they've been massively supportive. I kind of owe them a massive debt of gratitude, and maybe not to disappear off into the distant blue yonder for a while. But as I say, I'm always doing something. It's just whether it's a public thing or a private. I was just going to say my last thing is my second daughter's off to university this year as well. So, I need to do my bit as a dad, I think.
Well, if you do decide to do something big again, you're always welcome to come back on. And whereabouts can people find out more about you and, online, your website? And
well, if you have a big appetite and loads of endurance, you might be interested in the 2 blogs that I wrote. So I've got 2 websites, soloatlanticrow.com and solopacificrow.com. And I did tweet quite a bit when I was at sea, but I don't tweet when I've got nothing to say. I'm sure nobody's interested in what I had for breakfast. I don't have Facebook or anything like that. But the 2 websites are there if anybody's interested. I'm doing a little bit of public speaking, and that's where my charity money comes from. I donate anything I get from my speeches to my charity.
Yeah, I'll put all those links in the show notes.
Cool.
Thanks again for your time today. You're definitely at the top of the food chain when it comes to human endurance.
I'm not sure. There's a lot of tough people out there who do incredible things, and they're all impressive.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks again for your time. Incredibly inspiring story, and cool. All the best for the future.
Yeah. All right, Matthew. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Take care.
If you've made it this far in the Born to Kick Arse podcast, then you've done well. I want to continue introducing you to the most fascinating people on the planet so you can get an inside look at their approach, mindset, and secrets to success. Hopefully, these interviews will inspire you to take steps towards reaching your own goals, no matter how big or small. One common theme all these people have is that they are proactive, and I need you to be proactive right now by subscribing, rating, and reviewing this podcast on iTunes. I also need you to head over to borntokickarse.com and subscribe to my newsletter. Please also tell one close friend about this podcast, someone like you who also kicks ass and wants to realise their full human potential. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. What's stopping you from kicking arse?